And joining us now, Niall Ferguson, author of Civilization, the West and the Rest. He's the Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of History at Harvard University. It's great to have you back in that chair. Thanks for visiting us today.
Nice to be here, Steve. It's good to be here.
A pleasure. I'm going to list your 6 killer apps, and then we'll go from there, okay? So here they go, and it's very, very trendy, I guess, to call them killer apps today, but that's what the kids say, so we'll go with that. Here they are: competition, the scientific revolution, property rights, modern medicine, consumer society, and work ethic. Okay, make the case. You obviously looked at any number of different potential killer apps, and you decided on these 6. Why these 6?
Well, when you're trying to explain why for 500 years a minority of human beings become so much more successful economically, so much healthier, so much more powerful than everybody else, you do have to do some serious thinking. And I had to rule some things out. 100 years ago, if you'd asked the question, why did the West dominate the rest, many people would have said it was race. And my book says, no, that's certainly not the reason. More recently, with authors like Jared Diamond, geography has begun to play a big part. And some people would even mention the weather or traditional national culture, national identity. I think all of these things don't work. The key really was the institutions. Those changed in the late 15th, early 16th century. And although it's a bit of a mouthful to say ideas and institutions, therefore I said killer apps. Although it sounds like a kind of simple list, these 6 things together, I think, explain the Great Divergence, which put the West into a position of such extraordinary power and prosperity by the middle of the 20th century.
Well, I know some of the criticism you've received about this, and you actually deal with in the book, is, where's freedom? Where's democracy? Why aren't they on the list? So why aren't they on the list?
Well, in many ways, freedom is there. It's embedded in these institutions. But you have to be quite careful about saying democracy is a killer app, because the West became democratic relatively recently, whereas we're trying to explain something that started 500 or so years ago. And I think the rule of law is actually more fundamental to Western success than democracy. In many ways, the rule of law as it evolved in the English-speaking world implied representative government, because it was a rule of law which protected property owners from arbitrary violations of their rights by the sovereign. And in order to make sure that the sovereign stuck to the rules, you got representation in Parliament for property owners. That's really where it all begins in England hundreds of years ago. And when that idea is across the ocean, when it's transplanted to North America, it works even better because property ownership is much more widely distributed. So I think the origins of democracy as we understand it today lie in the way that the rule of law evolved in the English-speaking world, and that goes much further back. That's the real killer app.
And why didn't geography make your list? Because Jared Diamond, as you point out, he's got a whole career going on that.
I think geography explains why Eurasia, the great landmass, does much better over the very long run than, say, Australasia or indeed anywhere else. But if you're trying to explain why one end of Eurasia, Europe, does much, much better than the other end, China, I don't think geography is going to help you, because there aren't really that many profound geographical differences. Another way of thinking about this, Steve, is to say, let's look at the experiments we ran in the 20th century with places that had the same geography, the same national identity, but different institutions. We divided Germany in 2, and we divided Korea in 2. We took the same people in pretty much the same place, and we gave them different institutions. One lot got communism and the other didn't. And in each case, there was amazingly rapid divergence in behavior. So I'm putting my money on institutions, and that's good news, because in a way I'm saying these things can work anywhere. It doesn't matter what color your skin is, it doesn't matter your religion, it doesn't really matter whether it's an extremely hot country or an extremely cold country. These institutions can work for you. That's the positive lesson of the story.
Now, your story begins 500 years ago. And I wonder, back in the year 1500, how far behind was Western civilization, so-called, from everything else that was going on at the time?
Well, the way I think of this is in terms of a world tour that you might have done, let's say 600 years ago. Let's go right back to, say, 1411.
Okay.
If you'd gone on a tour of the world then, you would have been far more impressed by China, Ming China, than by anything you might have seen in Europe. Indeed, comparing a city like Nanjing, which was the imperial capital of Ming China, with London, you'd have been shocked by how small and smelly and violent London was. And London was quite an advanced European city. So in the early 15th century, it would have been very, very hard to predict the success of Europe relative to China, because in almost every measure, China looked far ahead. Or, for example, the Ottoman Empire would have looked more impressive to you on that tour. So we're having to explain something that in terms of the early 15th century would have seemed very unlikely, that these nasty little warring kingdoms of Europe were going to essentially take over the world. That's what the book sets out to do.
Part of it, I guess, is not just that we have these 6 killer apps going for us, but the rest of the world, what is it, coincidentally at the same time, was in a mood to destroy itself, or gave us an opening, if you like. Is that part of it as well?
This is a book of world history, not narrowly Western history, and it's not a triumphalist book. It asks the question, what was it that went wrong in these other civilizations, which led them to economically to stagnate, which is essentially what happens in China for hundreds of years. And one answer to that question is that China is highly centralized. There's one emperor who is in a position to prohibit oceanic navigation, which the successor to the Yongle emperor did. There is a simple, single, unified civil service. Anybody with any social ambition has to sit the exam, and the exam imposes pretty strict limits on the way that you think and write. This monolithic bureaucracy was not calculated to encourage innovation. And indeed, the whole Confucian mindset, which the bureaucracy internalized, was designed to promote harmony, not change. Cut to the other end of Eurasia, to Europe, and what you see is fragmentation. Lots of little states, no one emperor with all the power, no single bureaucracy, but multiple competing bureaucracies, and perhaps crucially, autonomous corporations running a lot of business life. The original corporation of the City of London, which is the ancestor of our modern corporations, had no analogue in China. There was nothing like that. Self-governing body of merchants that made the decisions about commerce. So I think it starts with a big institutional difference between centralized bureaucracy and fragmented competition.
That's your #1 killer app, competition. Right. Do you know where did that come from? The notion that the West would be open to that, but the rest would not be.
I think in some ways it was luck. I mean, it wasn't as if somebody sat down and said, let's come up with 6 killer apps to take over the world. It was happenstance that monarchs in Western Europe were relatively weak and couldn't, in fact, impose their authority on merchants. This simply wasn't true at the other end of Eurasia. Post-Roman Europe had a long period of stagnation. We call them the Dark Ages. I mean, it's 1,000 years, really, from the fall of Rome until things kick off in Europe. So another part of this story is clearly the Reformation. Something changes in the 16th century with Martin Luther, which fundamentally alters the way that people behave. And I spent a lot of time trying to think about this. And then it hit me. It's not just the printing press. It's the fact that Luther insists you have to read the Bible yourself, and you have to read it in your own language to be able to really be a good Christian. Now that's revolutionary, because once you can read the Bible, and once you can print the Bible, well, you can read anything.
You're off to the races.
I mean, I came across this amazing fact, which blew me away. Luther was asked by the good citizens of Basel, should we allow a translation of the Quran into German? We're pretty uncertain that we should allow this terrible book to be published. And he says, yeah, absolutely, you must, because that's the way that we can reveal its errors. Now that mindset that says, let everything be published, transforms the way that Europe behaves and paves the way to the scientific revolution. Meanwhile, in the Muslim world, which had been very successful scientifically and mathematically in, say, the 10th or 11th century, a different view is taken. In the Ottoman Empire, printing is banned, and it doesn't actually happen there until the 18th century. And there is a real clampdown on scientific inquiry, with the great observatory of Taqiyuddin being destroyed in Istanbul. So at the same time that the West is getting that right, the rest are getting it pretty wrong.
Let's stick with religion for a second. You've called #6 app on your list work ethic. Max Weber, I guess, would have called it Protestantism. Can you equate those two things, good old-fashioned Protestant work ethic?
There's clearly a link. And Weber was, I think, onto something when 100 years ago he talked about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. It was actually a trip to the US that convinced him this was true. He was in Missouri at the St. Louis World Fair, and he noticed how many churches there were everywhere. Lots of different Protestant sects setting up their churches. And he went back to Germany and wrote this now famous essay. Now, I think he was half right, because I don't think it's a uniquely Protestant phenomenon, the work ethic, even in his time. Even then, Jews in Europe were in fact exhibiting all the same traits that he was talking about: very purposeful activity, working long hours, trying to enhance efficiency. It's not, even then, it's not a purely Protestant phenomenon. But he was right about one thing, and that is the way in which Protestant